The auctioneer's gavel came down at 9:47 in the morning, and the sound of it traveled across the lawn like a gunshot. I was standing at the back of the crowd, behind the folding chairs and the real estate signs and the people who had come to buy pieces of my family's life. Nobody looked at me twice. I was just a woman in a gray coat, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Nobody knew my name. Nobody knew that the house behind them, the one with the white columns and the cracked front step that my father had promised to fix every single spring for 30 years, was supposed to be mine. The estate of Wren Calloway, 4 acres, main residence plus a guest cottage. Starting bid, $1.2 million. My father had been buried less than 18 hours earlier. If you have ever stood in a crowd and watched something be taken from you in real time, something that was yours before you even understood what ownership meant, then you already know what my body felt like in that moment. If you haven't, I hope you never do. But stay with me, because this story does not end with a gavel. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'll be reading while we go. My name is Wren Calloway. I am 44 years old. I teach 11th grade history at a private school in Western Virginia, which is a job I love and a job that tells people almost nothing true about me. History teachers are patient. History teachers notice when a document has been altered. History teachers know that the version of events written down first is not always the version that happened. What my students do not know, what my colleagues do not know, what almost nobody in my current life knows, is that for 11 years before I ever set foot in a classroom, I worked as a forensic document examiner under contract with federal courts and 3 state attorney general offices. I examined signatures. I dated ink. I identified paper stock inconsistencies. I testified in cases involving forged deeds, falsified wills, backdated contracts, and altered corporate records. I was very good at it. I left the field when my mother got sick, moved back to Virginia to help my father with her care, and eventually found that teaching suited me in ways the courtroom never quite had. But the skills do not leave you. They sit quietly in the back of your mind the way certain memories do, not fading, just waiting for the moment they become necessary again. My father was Edmund Harlow Calloway. He built his money slowly, the way people of his generation often did, through land purchases and patient decisions and a small timber operation that his own father had started in the 1950s. By the time I was born, the family property outside Elkton was already a place people noticed when they drove past. By the time I was 10, my father had added the guest cottage and the long gravel drive and the oak trees along the eastern fence that he planted himself, one by one, every year on my birthday. He told me once that planting something that would outlive you was the most honest thing a person could do. He was not a sentimental man. He said it once, quietly, while we were eating sandwiches on the porch, and then he went back inside and we never talked about it again. That was how he was. Everything important got said one time, clearly, and then the subject was closed. His sister, my Aunt Judith, was not like that at all. Judith Harlow was 2 years younger than my father and had spent most of her adult life in a state of grievance about the distance between what she felt she deserved and what she actually had. She married a man named Dale Harlow in the 1980s, and Dale had done reasonably well in commercial real estate until he didn't. And by the time he passed away in 2019, the Harlows had a house in Charlottesville, a son named Bo who had never held a job for more than 14 months, and a relationship with money that was best described as urgent. My father loved his sister the way you love someone who exhausts you. He invited her to every holiday. He lent her money on at least 4 occasions I knew of. He listened to her talk about Bo's potential with a straight face for 2 decades. He never said an unkind word about her in my presence. But he also told me the last clear conversation we had before his health declined past the point of reliable speech, that the property was mine, that he had handled it, that I did not need to worry. I did not worry. That was my first mistake. My father was diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition in the spring of 2022. He declined over the following 18 months in ways that were hard to watch and harder to document. By the fall of 2023, he was in a memory care facility outside Harrisonburg. By January of 2024, he was not reliably able to sign his own name. Judith began visiting him more frequently in those last months. At the time, I thought it was grief presenting itself early, the way it sometimes does when the end is visible but not yet arrived. She would sit with him for an hour, sometimes two. She brought him the peppermint candies he had always liked. She was attentive in a way she had never been when he was well. I should have questioned it then. I didn't. My father died on a Thursday afternoon in late March. He was 79 years old. He did not suffer at the end, which was the only mercy I had asked for and the one that was granted. The funeral was on Saturday. Judith sat in the front row. She wore black, and she wept, and she held my hand during the reception and told me that Edmund had been the best of them, the best of all of them, and she didn't know what any of them would do without him. On Sunday morning at 9:47, the auctioneer's gavel came down on the front lawn of my father's property. I had received the notification 4 days before the funeral. A certified letter from an attorney named Franklin Gore, whose office was located in Staunton, informing me that the estate of Edmund Harlow Calloway was to be liquidated per the terms of his will, dated October 14th, 2023, and that as I had previously executed a disclaimer of interest in the estate, I held no claim to any portion of the assets. I read that letter 3 times standing at my own mailbox. Then I went inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table. A disclaimer of interest is a legal document. It means that an heir voluntarily gives up their right to inherit. It is irrevocable once filed. It must be signed, witnessed, and notarized. I had never signed any such document. I knew what my father's signature looked like. I had been studying signatures professionally for 11 years. I knew the pressure variation in his pen strokes, the way his capital E leaned slightly forward, the gap he always left between the H and the I in Harlow. I also knew that in the fall of 2023, my father could no longer hold a pen with any reliability. I did not call Franklin Gore. I did not call Judith. I put the letter in a manila envelope, drove to a copy center, made 3 sets of copies, put 1 set in my kitchen drawer, mailed 1 set to a post office box I maintain in a neighboring county for reasons I will explain shortly, and drove home. Then I started making a list. The will that Franklin Gore referenced in his letter was dated October 14th, 2023. I knew my father's actual will. I had sat with him and his longtime attorney, a man named Gerald Purcell, who had handled the Calloway family's legal affairs for over 20 years when it was drafted in 2018. That document was clear, straightforward, and unambiguous. The property went to me. A modest cash account went to Judith as a gesture of goodwill. A small bequest went to the memory care facility that my father had specifically requested, should he ever need one, which he eventually did. Gerald Purcell had retired in 2021 and closed his practice. His files had been transferred to a records management service in Roanoke. Franklin Gore had opened his practice in Staunton in early 2023. His only listed client of public record, based on the filings I pulled that first evening, was an LLC registered 6 months earlier under the name Harlow Estate Consulting. The sole member of Harlow Estate Consulting was Judith and Harlow. I wrote that down. I underlined it once. I did not underline it twice because I did not need the emphasis. The fact was already loud enough on its own. The auction proceeded on Sunday while I stood in the back of the crowd and watched. I had come not to stop it, not yet, but to observe, to see who was there, to see how Judith moved through the morning. She stood near the front with Bo beside her. Bo was 38 years old and had the look of a man who had recently been told very good news. He was wearing a jacket that was slightly too new, the kind of new that suggests a recent purchase made in anticipation of a specific occasion. He kept his hands in his pockets and rocked forward on his heels when the bidding climbed past 1.4 million. Judith did not bid. She did not need to. The auction was the mechanism, not the destination. Whatever arrangement she had made, it did not require her to spend her own money in public. The property sold for $1.68 million to a buyer represented by a purchasing agent who, when I looked him up that afternoon, listed his business address as a mailbox service in Richmond. I drove home. I fed my cat. I sat at my desk and opened the file I had been building since the certified letter arrived. Here is what I want you to understand about the weeks that followed, because this part matters and I do not want to rush past it. Grief and investigation are not compatible states. They pull in opposite directions. Grief wants you to stop moving, to sit with the weight of what has happened, to let the loss take up the space it deserves. Investigation requires you to keep moving, to stay precise, to treat your own pain as information rather than weather. I was not able to grieve my father properly during those weeks. I am aware of that. I set it aside the way you set a glass down carefully when your hands are full, intending to come back for it, knowing it will still be there. What I focused on instead was the signature. The disclaimer of interest that had been filed with the court bore my name, my address, a notarization stamp from a notary in Augusta County, and a signature that was close. It was genuinely close. Whoever had produced it had done their research. The letter spacing was studied. The baseline was consistent. But there were 3 things wrong with it, and I saw all 3 of them within 4 minutes of examining the photocopy under the magnification glass I keep in my home office. The first was the pressure pattern. I write with my right hand, and I am what graphologists call a heavy pressure writer. The strokes in my signature, especially in the descending loop of the W, show consistent downward pressure that fades at the end of each stroke. The signature on the disclaimer showed uniform pressure throughout, which is characteristic of someone copying carefully from a model rather than writing from muscle memory. The second was the T crossing in Calloway. I crossed my T's on the upstroke, left to right, with a slight upward angle. The T in the disclaimer was crossed on the downstroke. It is a small thing. It is the kind of small thing that only matters when it is wrong every single time. The third was the date written beneath the signature. The disclaimer was purportedly signed on September 9th, 2023. On September 9th, 2023, I was in Richmond attending a 2-day professional development conference for history educators. I had a hotel receipt, a conference badge, 2 meal receipts, and photographs time-stamped across both days. I had not been in Augusta County on September 9th, 2023. I had not been within 90 miles of a notary named Deborah Klein, whose stamp appeared on the disclaimer. I requested Deborah Klein's notary commission records from the state. They arrived 8 days later. Deborah Klein had allowed her commission to lapse in April of 2023. The stamp on my disclaimer had been used in September of 2023, 5 months after her authority to notarize any document had legally expired. An expired notary stamp on a disclaimer of interest filed with a probate court in service of a will that had been executed 11 days before my father lost the ability to hold a pen with any reliability. I wrote that down too. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you about Bo Harlow, because Bo is not the architect of what happened, and I think that distinction matters. Bo is not a clever man. He is a man who has spent his entire adult life being managed by his mother, pointed in direction she selected, and rewarded just enough to ensure continued compliance. When I thought about him standing on that lawn with his new jacket and his rocking heels, I did not feel contempt. I felt something closer to pity, which is its own kind of sorrow. He had almost certainly known what his mother was doing. He had almost certainly said nothing, because saying nothing had always been the path of least resistance available to him. That made him complicit. It did not make him the one who had planned it. Judith had planned it. Judith and Franklin Gore. I found the first wire transfer 11 days after the auction. I had filed a formal records request with the Augusta County Circuit Court for all documents associated with my father's probate proceeding. Among the documents returned was a fee agreement between Franklin Gore's office and Harlow Estate Consulting LLC, dated March 3rd, 2023, 12 days after my father's neurological diagnosis had been formally entered into his medical records at the Harrisonburg facility. 12 days. She had started planning this 12 days after the diagnosis was official, before he had shown any significant cognitive decline, before most people would have even begun thinking about what came next. She had started planning when she realized the window was going to open, and she intended to be ready when it did. I sat with that for a long time, not because it surprised me, because it didn't. And the absence of surprise was its own particular grief. The recognition that you had been naive about someone you had trusted, not because they had concealed their nature, but because you had simply chosen not to see it clearly. My father had seen it. He had made a will in 2018 precisely because he had seen it. And then someone had made another one. There's a post office box in a town called Bridgewater, about 40 minutes from where I live, that I have maintained for 12 years. I opened it originally for professional reasons, back when I was still working federal contracts and receiving sensitive case materials by mail. When I left that work, I kept it, not for any specific purpose. More the way you keep a tool that no longer has an obvious use, but that you cannot bring yourself to return, because some part of you understands that tools are not always needed until they suddenly are. The copies of Franklin Gore's letter that I had mailed to that box on the day I received them were still there, sealed, untouched, postmarked. That postmark mattered. It established that I had received the notification on a specific date and had immediately treated it as something requiring preservation. It was a small thing. It would become relevant later. What I am about to describe took place over approximately 6 weeks. I want to walk through it carefully, because the way I gathered evidence is as important as the evidence itself. Nothing I did was illegal. Everything I did was documented. I treated the entire process the way I had been trained to treat a contested document examination, which is to say, I assumed I would eventually have to explain every single step to a federal judge, and I worked accordingly. The first piece I needed was the 2023 will itself, the document that had superseded my father's 2018 will, and that had been submitted to probate by Franklin Gore. Probate records in Virginia are public. I drove to the Augusta County Courthouse and requested the file in person. The clerk, a quiet woman named Patricia who had worked that desk for what appeared to be a very long time, pulled the folder without comment and set it in front of me. I spent 2 hours with that file. I photographed every page with my phone. I did not touch the original documents with my bare hands. I wore the thin cotton gloves I had brought in my coat pocket, which earned me exactly one raised eyebrow from Patricia and nothing further. The 2023 will was 4 pages long. It named Judith Harlow as sole beneficiary of the estate. It named Franklin Gore as executor. It was signed on October 14th, 2023 by Edmund Harlow Calloway and witnessed by 2 individuals whose names I did not recognize, a Paulette Voss and a man named Craig Dunn. My father's signature on that document was wrong in the same way my own forged signature had been wrong. Uniform pressure. No natural variation. The capital E in Edmund leaned slightly backward, which it had never done in any document I had examined bearing his authentic signature, and I had examined many. His signature on tax filings, on property deeds going back to 1987, on the 2018 will, on correspondence I had kept over the years. The lien was wrong. The lien was always wrong when someone was copying from a static model rather than writing from the motion memory that develops over a lifetime. I photographed the signature. I photographed the witness signatures as well. Then I went home and searched for Paulette Voss and Craig Dunn. Paulette Voss had a Facebook profile that was partially public. She had been employed until 8 months ago as a receptionist at a dental office in Staunton whose address was 4 blocks from Franklin Gore's office. She was currently listed as working in office administration. Craig Dunn had a LinkedIn profile that listed him as an office manager. His current employer was Franklin Gore, attorney at law. One of the witnesses to my father's will was the office manager of the attorney who had drafted and filed that will and who stood to collect executor fees from the resulting estate. I wrote that down. I added it to the file, which by this point had grown to include printed records, photograph logs, certified mail receipts, and a handwritten timeline that I updated every evening before I went to sleep. The second piece I needed was an independent forensic analysis of both signatures, mine and my father's, from someone whose credentials would be unimpeachable in a courtroom setting. I could not serve as the expert witness in my own case. That is not how it works, and I was not going to compromise what I was building by making it easy to dismiss. I contacted a colleague named Ruth Ansley, who runs a private document examination practice in Northern Virginia and who had testified as an expert witness in over 60 cases across federal and state courts. Ruth and I had worked parallel cases twice during my contract years. She was precise, thorough, and entirely without sentimentality about her conclusions. I sent her the photocopies. I sent her the conference receipts and time-stamped photographs from September 9th, 2023. I sent her a comparative set of 17 authenticated Wren Calloway signatures spanning 1987 to 2022, sourced from public property records and documents I had personal custody of. I sent her the 2023 will signature and my own disclaimer signature. I did all of this through a formal engagement letter with a documented chain of custody for every item transmitted. Ruth acknowledged receipt in writing for each package. Her preliminary findings came back in 3 weeks. She identified my disclaimer signature as, in her professional language, inconsistent with the known signature exemplars of Wren Calloway in pressure pattern, stroke direction, and T-bar formation, and consistent with a carefully executed simulation produced from a static visual model. She identified my father's signature on the 2023 will as inconsistent with the known exemplars of Edmund Harlow Calloway in letter slant, pressure distribution, and baseline control, and noted specifically that the signature showed characteristics associated with production by an individual unfamiliar with the natural writing movement of the signer. She further noted that the signature on the 2023 will was inconsistent with signatures produced by individuals experiencing the type of neurological decline documented in my father's medical records from the same period, because such individuals typically show increased tremor and inconsistency rather than the uniform, controlled strokes present on the document. In plain language, the signature on the will was too steady to have been made by a man whose hands shook the way my father's hands shook in October of 2023. It had been made by someone whose hands did not shake at all. I printed Ruth's preliminary report. I added it to the file. The third piece was the notary. I drove to Augusta County on a Tuesday morning and knocked on the door of the address listed for Deborah Klein in the state's notary records. It was a small house on a residential street. A woman in her late 60s answered the door. She had the careful expression of someone who had recently been made to feel frightened by something she did not fully understand. I told her my name. I told her I was not there to cause her trouble. I told her I was trying to understand what had happened with the document that bore her stamp. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened the door and let me in. What Deborah Klein told me, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, was this. A woman had come to her home in August of 2023. The woman had said she was helping an elderly neighbor manage some paperwork, and that the neighbor was unable to travel. She had asked Deborah to notarize several documents. Deborah had done it because she had been notarizing documents for neighbors and acquaintances for 20 years, and it had never been a problem. She had not realized her commission had lapsed. She had not checked. She renewed it automatically every 4 years, and she had simply lost track of the date. The woman who had come to her door, Deborah said, was well-dressed, probably in her early 60s, with short silver hair and a way of speaking that made you feel like she was doing you a favor by asking. I showed Deborah a photograph. It was a photograph from Judith Harlow's Facebook profile, a public image from a family gathering 2 years earlier. Deborah looked at it for a long time. She said, "That is the woman who came to my door." I asked her if she would be willing to say that again, in writing, to an attorney. She said she would. I thanked her, drove to the copy center, made duplicates of everything. And then I made a phone call I had been preparing to make for 5 weeks. The attorney I called was named Simone Okafor. I had found her through a referral from Ruth Ansley, who described her as someone who did not take cases she could not win and did not warn people twice. Simone practiced civil litigation with a concentration in probate fraud and estate disputes. Her office was in Charlottesville. She had been practicing for 19 years. I sent her the file before our first meeting. All of it. The timeline, the photographs, the probate records, Ruth's preliminary report, Deborah Klein's statement, the wire transfer documentation, the LLC filing showing Judith's relationship with Franklin Gore predating my father's death by over a year, the conference receipts from September 9th, the postmarked envelope from Bridgewater. Simone called me the evening she finished reading it. She said, "You built this like someone who knew it was going to court." I said, "I built it like someone who knew it needed to be airtight before it got there." She said she would take the case. What followed was not fast. I want to be honest about that because stories like this one sometimes compress the legal process into something that feels immediate and satisfying in its speed. And the reality is that the law moves on its own schedule, which bears no relationship to the schedule of your grief or your anger or your need for resolution. Simone filed a petition to contest the 2023 will in Augusta County Circuit Court in late May. The petition challenged the document on 3 grounds: lack of testamentary capacity, given my father's documented neurological state in October of 2023, undue influence, given Judith's pattern of increased contact during his period of cognitive decline, and fraud, based on Ruth Ansley's forensic findings regarding the signature. Simultaneously, she filed a motion to void the disclaimer of interest bearing my forged signature, supported by Ruth's analysis, my conference documentation, and Deborah Klein's written statement regarding the expired notary stamp and her identification of Judith as the woman who had brought the documents to her home. Franklin Gore filed a response within 2 weeks. It was dismissive in tone and thin in substance, which Simone said was exactly what she had expected from an attorney who had not anticipated that the person he was filing against would have a forensic document examiner's 11 years of federal court experience sitting quietly behind her gray coat. The circuit court scheduled a hearing for the second week of July. I want to tell you about the morning of that hearing because it is the part of this story I have returned to most often in the months since. The Augusta County Courthouse is a brick building on a corner in downtown Staunton. I arrived 40 minutes early. Simone was already there at the plaintiff's table, organizing her materials with the particular calm of someone who has stood in this room many times and knows exactly how much space she is allowed to take up. Judith arrived 12 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. She came in with Bo on one side and Franklin Gore on the other. She was dressed carefully, in a dark blue suit that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and she walked with the posture of a woman who believed the outcome of this morning was already settled. She did not see me immediately. When she did, something moved across her face that she controlled very quickly. It was not guilt. People like Judith do not tend to experience guilt in the legible way that word implies. It was something closer to recalculation, the expression of someone who has just been informed that a variable they had dismissed is still in the equation. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I sat down. The hearing lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Simone presented the forensic evidence first. Ruth Ansley testified via video deposition, walking the court through her methodology and findings with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this 63 times before and found it no less serious for the repetition. She explained the pressure pattern analysis. She explained the T-bar formation. She explained why a signature produced by a man in my father's neurological condition in October of 2023 would be expected to show specific characteristics that were entirely absent from the document submitted to probate. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Wembley, who had clearly read the filings in advance and arrived with specific questions already prepared, asked Ruth to clarify the confidence level of her conclusions. Ruth said, "I am as certain as my methodology allows me to be, which is the same standard I apply in every federal case I have worked, and that standard has not been successfully challenged in 19 years. Then Simone introduced Deborah Klein. Deborah was nervous. She had told me she would be nervous, and I had told her that nervous and honest were not incompatible, which seemed to help her slightly. She sat in the witness chair with her hands in her lap, and she answered every question in a voice that was quiet but consistent. She described the woman who had come to her door in August of 2023. She described the documents she had been asked to notarize. She confirmed that she had not verified the identity of the person whose signature she was notarizing, that she had not confirmed the signer was present, and that she had not been aware her commission had lapsed. Then Simone asked her to look at the photograph. The photograph was printed on a standard sheet of paper and marked as Exhibit F. It showed Judith Harlow at a family gathering, smiling, holding a glass of wine, looking entirely like someone who had never done anything worth examining. Deborah looked at it for 3 seconds. She said, "Yes, that is the woman." Franklin Gore's cross-examination of Deborah lasted 16 minutes. He suggested her memory was unreliable. He noted the time that had passed between August of 2023 and the present hearing. He implied, without quite stating it, that an elderly woman who had failed to track her own notary commission's expiration date was perhaps not the most reliable identifier of faces. Deborah listened to all of it with her hands still folded in her lap. Then she said, "I remember her because she made me feel like a useful fool, and that is not a feeling I forget." The courtroom was quiet after that. Gore called Judith to testify. This was, Simone told me afterward, a tactical error of the kind that tends to occur when an attorney has confused confidence with preparation. Judith testified that she had visited her brother frequently in his final months out of love and concern. She testified that she had known nothing about any document examiner coming to speak with Deborah Klein. She testified that the 2023 will reflected her brother's genuine wishes, expressed to her privately on multiple occasions. Simone's cross-examination was 17 minutes long. She began with the LLC. She asked Judith when she had formed Harlow Estate Consulting. Judith said she did not recall the exact date. Simone showed her the filing, dated 9 months before my father's death. She asked Judith what services the LLC had been formed to provide. Judith said estate planning consulting. Simone asked her to name one client of Harlow Estate Consulting other than the Calloway estate. Judith said the business had been in early stages. Simone asked her about the fee agreement with Franklin Gore, dated 12 days after my father's neurological diagnosis was entered into his medical record. She asked Judith how she had known, in March of 2023, that her brother's estate would require the services of a new attorney, given that he had worked with the same attorney for over 2 decades. Judith said she had simply wanted to be prepared. Simone said, prepared for what, specifically? Judith did not answer that question in any way that helped her. Then Simone introduced the wire transfer records. 3 transfers, totaling $41,000, had moved from a checking account in Judith Harlow's name to an account registered to Harlow Estate Consulting between January and March of 2024, in the weeks immediately following the auction. The auction had generated $1.68 million. The Purchasing Agents LLC, the one with the Richmond mailbox address, had been registered 6 weeks before the auction date. Simone asked Judith if she was familiar with that LLC. Judith said she was not. Simone showed her the registered agent filing, which listed Bo Harlow's cell phone number as the contact for the entity. Bo, sitting in the gallery, went very still. Judge Wembley called a recess at that point. When she returned, she stated that she was referring the matter to the Augusta County Commonwealth's Attorney's Office for criminal review, and that she was issuing an immediate order freezing all assets associated with the Calloway estate pending the outcome of the will contest proceedings. Franklin Gore asked to approach the bench. The judge indicated he could do so at the appropriate time, which was not now. Judith sat at the defense table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and her eyes on a point in the middle distance that I could not identify from where I was sitting. Bo left the courtroom during the recess. He did not come back. The criminal referral moved faster than the civil case, which surprised me and did not surprise Simone. She explained it this way. Civil courts move slowly because they are trying to be precise. Criminal referrals involving documentary fraud move quickly when the documents are already organized, the forensic analysis is already complete, and a cooperating witness has already given a written statement. The Commonwealth's attorney does not need to build the case from the beginning when someone has already built it for them. What I had handed them, Simone said, was not a complaint. It was a brief. The Augusta County Commonwealth's attorney opened a formal investigation in August. By September, the investigation had expanded to include the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, triggered by the wire transfers crossing state lines. That is the mechanism by which a local forgery case becomes a federal wire fraud matter, and it is the mechanism that changes the sentencing calculus considerably. Franklin Gore retained a criminal defense attorney within 48 hours of the federal expansion becoming public. His new attorney filed a motion to withdraw from the civil probate case on the grounds of conflict of interest, which was granted. Franklin Gore then did what attorneys who are themselves the subject of a bar investigation sometimes do when the evidence against them is organized and specific. He began cooperating. His cooperation was limited. He provided documentation of communications with Judith regarding the 2023 will. He confirmed that the will had been drafted at Judith's direction and that he had not personally witnessed my father sign it. He stated that Paulette Voss and Craig Dunn had signed the witness lines at Judith's request in his office on a date when my father was not present. Craig Dunn, Gore's own office manager, confirmed this account separately. The forgery charge was filed against Judith Harlow in October. The wire fraud charge, related to the interstate transfer of funds derived from the fraudulent sale of the estate, was filed by federal prosecutors in November. Though Harlow was not charged, he had retained his own attorney immediately after leaving the courthouse in July and had provided a proffer agreement that established his knowledge of the scheme, but documented his non-participation in its execution. His mother had not told him the specific details of how the will had been produced. He had known the outcome was wrong and had said nothing, which made him a moral failure and a cooperating witness, and those two designations are not mutually exclusive under the law. I have been asked more than once how I feel about Bo not being charged. I think about the jacket he was wearing on the morning of the auction. I think about a man who has spent 38 years being steered by someone who never once steered him toward anything worth becoming. I think about the fact that he is now, by his own account, estranged from his mother and living in a state of reckoning with his own choices that no prosecutor imposed on him. I think the law gave him what the law could give him. What he does with the rest of it is his. The civil case concluded in February of the following year. Judge Wembley voided the 2023 will in its entirety on grounds of fraud and lack of testamentary capacity. She reinstated the 2018 will as the operative document governing my father's estate. She voided the disclaimer of interest bearing my forged signature and restored my standing as sole heir. The property sale was unwound through a separate proceeding. The purchasing LLC, which had been registered by Bo, but had never transferred the property to a subsequent buyer, was dissolved and the title reverted to the estate. This process took 4 additional months and involved a negotiation I will not detail here except to say that it resolved in the estate's favor. The property is mine now. I have been back twice. The first time, I walked the perimeter alone in the late afternoon and did not go inside. The second time, I brought a thermos of coffee and sat on the front porch for 2 hours and let the grief come. The proper grief, the kind I had set aside, like a glass I intended to return to. The front step is still cracked. My father never fixed it. I have decided not to fix it either. Not yet. Maybe not ever. It is the kind of thing that outlives the person who meant to get around to it, and I have come to think there is something honest in that. Judith Harlow pleaded guilty to the forgery charge in March. The federal wire fraud plea followed in May, negotiated as part of a package that included full restitution to the estate, a fine, and a sentence of 22 months in a federal correctional facility with supervised release to follow. Her attorney argued for a downward departure based on her age and lack of prior criminal record. The federal judge noted that the scheme had been premeditated over a period of at least 14 months, had targeted a cognitively vulnerable individual in the final stage of his life, and had been executed with deliberate and documented care, and declined to depart downward. Franklin Gore surrendered his law license in December, concurrent with his own guilty plea to a charge of aiding and abetting document fraud. He received 3 years of probation and a fine. He will not practice law again. I have thought a lot, in the months since all of this concluded, about what my father said on that porch about planting things that outlive you. He was talking about the oak trees along the eastern fence, I think. He was talking about the literal act of putting something in the ground and walking away from it, trusting that it would continue without you. But I have come to think he might also have been talking about the other things people plant. The decisions made carefully. The documents signed with intention. The wills drafted with a clear mind and a trusted attorney before the window closes, because there are people in the world who watch for windows. He planted a will in 2018. He planted it knowing that his sister was the kind of person who would look for a gap. He handed it to a man he trusted, and when that man retired, the chain broke, and someone stepped into the break. What he could not have planned for was that his daughter would spend 11 years learning exactly how to recognize what had been planted in his place. I am not a person who believes that things happen for reasons. I do not think my career in forensic document examination was preparation for this moment in any cosmic or design sense. I think I learned a skill and I left it, and the skill waited because skills do not have anywhere else to go. But I do think about what would have happened if I had not known what I knew. If I had read Franklin Gore's letter and believed it. If I had accepted the disclaimer as real. If I had stood at the back of that auction and watched, and then driven home and grieved in the ordinary way and never looked at the signature. Someone else would be living in my father's house. The crack in the front step would be fixed by now, by someone who had no reason to leave it. And somewhere in Charlottesville, a woman in a dark blue suit would be having dinner with her son and thinking that preparation had been enough, that she had planned well, that some people simply do not look closely enough at what is put in front of them. She thought I was a history teacher. She was not wrong, but history teachers know something that people who rewrite documents tend to forget. The original is always somewhere. You just have to know where to look.